The massive space cruiser, the Elysium, gleamed in the distant starlight as it hovered above the atmosphere of the luxury terminal. It was the largest tour spaceship ever built, a symbol of excess and opulence, where the galaxy's wealthiest elite gathered for an extraordinary journey through the stars. From its towering golden hull to its shimmering glass-domed lounges, every detail of the Elysium whispered of luxury and grandeur. But for Ronan Talon, a seasoned warship pilot with the kind of wealth that could buy him anything in the galaxy, the allure of riches held no charm. He stepped aboard the Elysium as a solo traveler, blending into the crowd without drawing attention to his wealth. His tailored but unassuming attire was a stark contrast to the extravagant garb of other passengers. Ronan was a man who had seen the depths of space, fought in wars, and accumulated a fortune. But none of that mattered to him here. This journey was meant for solitude, a break from the demanding life he led. The spaceship's grand entrance hall hummed with the excitement of passengers. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns woven with stardust, and families dressed in luxury clothing flocked to their quarters, eager for the voyage to begin. A soft automated voice welcomed each guest, and for most, this was the start of an experience they'd never forget. Ronan didn't care about the luxury. What he needed was time to himself, a rare thing in his line of work. He glanced around briefly before heading toward his cabin, a modest suite that, by the Elysium standards, was almost laughably small, but that's how he liked it. Meanwhile, on the lower decks, Selune stood in awe as she looked up at the towering walls of the ship. She had never seen anything like this in her life. Winning the charity lottery had been nothing short of a miracle, a chance to escape her humble existence, even if just for a short while. Born on Area, a resource-strapped planet known for its breathtakingly beautiful but impoverished people, Selune's talents as a mechanic and engineer were the only things that had given her an edge in life. Yet her true beauty, the hallmark of her planet's people, was something she had always taken for granted. As Selune gazed up at the ship, she couldn't help but feel out of place. Surrounded by the rich and powerful, she was a stark contrast in her simple attire, her mechanical tools still strapped to her waist, almost as if she expected to get called to fix something at any moment. The Elysium felt like an alien world to her, filled with luxury and extravagance that she'd never known. She wasn't here to bask in the glory of it all. She was here because fate had decided to give her a ticket. But Selune's heart was humble. She had no illusions of grandeur, nor did she feel envious of the elite passengers she shared the ship with. She was here for the experience, to taste freedom among the stars and escape her daily grind, even if only for a few weeks. As she made her way to her room in the lower decks, Selune caught a glimpse of someone who seemed strangely different from the rest of the passengers. He was tall, well-built, with an air of calm confidence that seemed out of place among the excited crowd. His sharp jawline and piercing green eyes stood out, and though he didn't dress like the wealthiest of them, something about him felt important. She didn't know why, but she found herself stealing one last glance before he disappeared into a hallway. It wasn't long before fate brought Ronan and Selune together. The first day aboard the ship, a grand celebration was held on one of the upper decks, a formal dinner that all passengers were invited to attend. The ship's captain gave a rousing speech, toasting to a successful journey ahead, and the guests, dressed in their finest, began to mingle. Ronan sat at a corner table quietly observing the room. The bright lights, the laughter, the music, it all felt distant to him. He had no interest in mingling with the galaxy's elite, no desire to join in their idle chatter. And then, across the room, he saw her. Selune stood out not because of her wealth or her dress. Her attire was simple, functional even, but because of something deeper. Her beauty was undeniable, a natural radiance that made her seem otherworldly. Unlike the other women in the room who flaunted their wealth, Selune seemed almost uncomfortable being there, her eyes scanning the room like someone who didn't belong. Their eyes met briefly. Selune, feeling self-conscious, quickly looked away, but for Ronan that one glance was enough to intrigue him. Who was she? He could tell she wasn't like the others, and that piqued his curiosity. Selune tried to blend into the crowd as best she could. She had been invited to the dinner out of courtesy, but she felt like an outsider among the glittering, affluent guests. Her heart raced when she realized the man she had seen earlier was seated just a few tables away from her. His presence unnerved her in a way she couldn't explain. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her feel both curious and cautious. As the evening wore on, Selune found herself at the edge of the room, sipping a drink and quietly observing the festivities. It was then that Ronan approached her. His voice was calm, his demeanor relaxed, as if he'd been in situations like this countless times. "Enjoying the evening?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undertone of genuine interest. Selune blinked in surprise, not expecting someone like him to speak to her. "I suppose," she replied softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that hinted at her origins. "It's different." Ronan smiled slightly. "Different, yes, but you don't seem like you're one to be impressed by all this." She raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. "And you seem like you've seen more than your fair share of it." He chuckled lightly, a deep, soothing sound. "You're not wrong." There was a pause as they regarded each other, a subtle tension between them, an understanding that neither of them fit in with the rest of the crowd. For Selune, the moment felt surreal. She had never been good at making small talk, especially with men who seemed so sure of themselves. But Ronan didn't seem to be like the others. He wasn't trying to impress her, he was simply there. Before the conversation could go deeper, a figure stepped into their space, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "Ah, Selune, there you are." Caspian, the heir to a galaxy-wide corporate empire, approached with a smirk that made Selune's skin crawl. Caspian was tall, well-dressed, and exuded an arrogance that only immense wealth could afford. He had been pursuing Selune since the moment he learned she was aboard, convinced that someone as beautiful as her should be his, regardless of what she wanted. Selune stiffened. "Caspian." "I've been looking for you," Caspian said, completely ignoring Ronan's presence. "Join me at my table. I'd hate for you to be alone." Selune's eyes darted to Ronan, hoping he might intervene, but Ronan simply watched, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine here," she replied, her voice firmer than before. Caspian's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Nonsense. You deserve better company." Ronan finally spoke, his voice low but commanding. "I think she's made it clear she's fine where she is." Caspian turned his gaze to Ronan, his expression darkening. "And who might you be?" "Just someone who respects her wishes," Ronan replied evenly, not breaking eye contact. A tense silence followed. Caspian, clearly not used to being challenged, sneered before turning back to Selune. "We'll talk later." He gave her one last look before walking away. Selune exhaled, her body relaxing as soon as he left. She turned to Ronan, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she whispered. Ronan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "He seems persistent." "You have no idea." The soft hum of the Elysium's engines filled the silence as the ship soared through the galaxy. Outside, stars twinkled in the endless black expanse, but inside, the mood among the passengers was growing increasingly tense. Ronan leaned against a railing, looking out one of the many observation windows, his thoughts drifting back to the dinner from the night before. There was something about her that stirred something deep within him, a sense of curiosity, of wanting to protect her from the smug and overconfident Caspian, but also a desire to know her more deeply. She wasn't like the others on the ship. Her simplicity and quiet strength stood out in a sea of wealth and entitlement. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. He turned, and there she was. Selune approached cautiously, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jumpsuit, the same one she'd worn during her engineering shifts. She smiled slightly when their eyes met, the tension from the previous evening still lingering between them. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Ronan gestured toward the railing, inviting her to stand beside him. "Of course." For a moment they stood in silence, both looking out at the vastness of space. Selune spoke first. "I wanted to thank you again for last night. Caspian, well, he doesn't take no for an answer." Ronan glanced at her, his expression soft but serious. "I noticed. He's used to getting what he wants." She sighed, leaning against the railing. "Yes, and unfortunately people like me are usually the ones he targets." "What do you mean by that?" Selune hesitated for a moment, then turned to face him. "I'm not like the others on this ship, Ronan. I'm not wealthy or powerful. I'm just lucky. I won a charity lottery to be here. I'm from Area, a planet most people barely even know exists." Ronan raised an eyebrow. "I've heard of Area. The people there are known for their beauty." Selune gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yes, beauty. but not much else. My planet is poor, with barely enough resources to keep us alive, let alone prosper. The only thing we're known for is our looks, but that doesn't put food on the table." Ronan's gaze softened as he listened. Selune's honesty and vulnerability were refreshing, a stark contrast to the artificiality that surrounded them on the Elysium. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't, and that drew him to her even more. "You're not just beautiful, Selune," he said quietly. "You're smart. You're strong. You've got more going for you than most of the people here." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like that, without ulterior motives, without trying to win her over. Ronan's words felt genuine, and that scared her more than anything. While Ronan and Selune's bond quietly grew stronger, Caspian was stewing in his own frustration. He sat in his private suite, glaring at the holographic projection of the Elysium's passenger manifest, his fingers tapping impatiently on the arm of his chair. How could she choose him? Some nobody who couldn't even afford a proper suit at the dinner. Caspian had wealth, power, and influence, everything a woman like Selune should desire. Yet, she had rejected him, and worse, she had turned to that man. Caspian's jaw tightened as he watched security footage of Ronan and Selune talking on the observation deck. His father had always taught him that money could buy anything, and in Caspian's experience it had. But this time was different, and that infuriated him. He couldn't let it stand. With a flick of his wrist, Caspian called up a private communication channel. A figure appeared on the screen, a stern-looking man in a crisp black uniform, the head of the Elysium's private security force. "I want you to keep an eye on them," Caspian ordered, his voice cold. "That man, Ronan Talon and Selune. I don't care what it takes, but I want to know everything they're doing, and if he steps out of line, deal with him." The security chief nodded. "Understood, sir." Caspian ended the transmission and leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile creeping onto his face. No one defied Caspian Ferris and got away with it. Over the next few days, Ronan and Selune spent more time together. They shared quiet moments in the observation lounge, talking about their lives, their pasts, and their dreams. Ronan was fascinated by Selune's stories of area, of the beauty and hardship that coexisted on her home planet. Selune in turn found herself drawn to Ronan's quiet strength and the way he listened to her, truly listened, without judgment or expectation. One evening, as they stood on the lower decks of the ship overlooking the engine rooms, Selune pointed to a large, complex machine that powered the ship's energy systems. "I helped build something like this once," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Back home, we don't have access to the kind of technology they do here, but we make do with what we have. My family taught me how to fix and build machines when I was a kid." Ronan raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You're an engineer, then?" "Not officially," she replied, smiling, "but I can fix just about anything if you give me the tools." "I believe you." Ronan's tone was sincere, and Selune felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had never met someone who believed in her abilities so easily, without questioning her background or status. For the first time in a long time, Selune felt like she could be herself. There were no expectations with Ronan, no pressure to impress or prove herself, and that was a rare feeling, especially on a ship like the Elysium. But even as their bond grew, the danger surrounding them also intensified. Caspian's obsession had turned into a dangerous fixation, and his efforts to undermine Ronan were growing more sinister by the day. Late one night, while the ship was quiet and most of the passengers were asleep, Ronan woke to the sound of a soft knock on his cabin door. Instinctively, his hand went to the small blaster he kept hidden under his pillow. Years of serving in the military had taught him to be prepared for anything. He opened the door cautiously, only to find Selune standing there, her eyes wide with fear. "Ronan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone's been following me. I don't know who, but I think Caspian's involved." Ronan's eyes narrowed. He had suspected that Caspian wouldn't let things go, but this was more serious than he had anticipated. He stepped aside, letting Selune into his cabin. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low and calm, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. Selune sat on the edge of his bed, her hands trembling as she recounted the events of the past few days. Strange figures had been watching her, shadowing her every move, and she had caught glimpses of security personnel whispering in dark corners whenever she passed. She had tried to ignore it at first, but the feeling of being watched had become too much to bear. "I don't know what he's planning, but I don't trust him," Selune said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's dangerous, Ronan." Ronan's jaw tightened. "I won't let him hurt you." Their eyes met, and for a moment the weight of everything else seemed to disappear. Ronan stepped closer, gently taking her hand in his. There was a quiet intensity in the air, a shared understanding that they were in this together. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Selune admitted softly, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "You won't have to find out," Ronan replied, his voice steady and sure. "I'll protect you, Selune, no matter what." Ronan's promise to protect Selune weighed heavily on his mind as he led her out of his cabin and into the quiet corridors of the Elysium. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, not with Caspian's men likely watching their every move. The ship was a maze of luxury, but for someone like Ronan, who had spent years navigating military vessels in the far reaches of space, it was easy enough to find the hidden paths that most passengers never knew existed. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft against the plush carpeting. Selune stayed close to Ronan, her heart pounding in her chest, but feeling safe beside him. She had never felt this kind of fear before, being pursued, watched, and hunted down by someone like Caspian, whose wealth and power seemed limitless. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. "We need to stay ahead of him," Ronan said, his voice calm but firm. "Caspian has money, and he's used to using it to get what he wants, but we have an advantage he doesn't." "What's that?" "Experience," Ronan replied. "I've dealt with people like him before. The key is not letting him corner us." They slipped into one of the lower maintenance corridors, where the lavish decorations of the upper decks gave way to bare metal walls and dim lighting. It was here, in the bowels of the ship, that the real workings of the Elysium could be seen. This was Selune's world, a world of engines and mechanics, where the glittering facade of wealth meant nothing compared to the raw functional power that kept the ship running. Selune felt a strange sense of comfort here, despite the danger that loomed over them. She could see the mechanics working, hear the low hum of the engines, and it reminded her of home, of the long hours she'd spent in her family's workshop, learning how to build and repair machines. "This way," Ronan said, leading her toward a small maintenance bay where they could hide for a while. As they stepped inside, Selune let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned against the wall, her head spinning from everything that had happened in the past few days. Meeting Ronan, being pursued by Caspian, the growing tension on the ship, it was all too much. Ronan watched her carefully, his sharp green eyes softening as he saw the exhaustion on her face. He moved closer, his voice gentle. "You're safe with me." Selune looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. For a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged with an unspoken intensity, a deep connection that had been building since the moment they met. Ronan reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his touch light but electrifying. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice low and steady. Selune's heart skipped a beat. She had always been strong, independent, never needing anyone to protect her. But with Ronan, it was different. There was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. Without thinking, she stepped closer to him, her hand resting against his chest. His heart was steady beneath her fingers, a calm rhythm that grounded her in the midst of the chaos. And then, before she could stop herself, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. But Ronan responded, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, filled with the pent-up tension and emotion that had been simmering between them since they first met. In that moment, nothing else mattered. No ship, no Caspian, no danger. It was just them, wrapped in each other's embrace. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Selune's eyes searched his, her cheeks flushed. She began, but Ronan silenced her with another soft kiss, his lips lingering against hers. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I feel the same." While Ronan and Selune sought refuge in the lower decks, Caspian's obsession was spiraling out of control. In his private quarters, he paced back and forth, his mind racing with plans and schemes. His father had always told him that power was everything, that with enough money and influence, the galaxy would bend to his will. But Selune had rejected him. How could she choose someone like Ronan over him? His eyes flicked to the security monitor in the corner of the room, where footage of the ship's corridors played on a loop. He had ordered his men to find them, to track their every movement, but so far, they had evaded him. Caspian's anger boiled over. He slammed his fist against the table, knocking over a glass that shattered on the floor. If she won't come to me willingly, then I'll make sure she has no choice. He reached for the communicator on his desk and contacted the head of security once again. The stern-faced man appeared on the screen, awaiting his orders. "Lock down the lower decks," Caspian commanded, his voice dripping with venom. "No one leaves without my permission, and find them, now." The security chief nodded. "As you wish, sir." Caspian leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Ronan might think he could protect her, but Caspian had the entire ship at his disposal. He would have Selune, one way or another. Back in the maintenance bay, Ronan and Selune were still catching their breath when the overhead lights flickered, and a low, ominous hum filled the room. Ronan's eyes narrowed, instantly alert. He had heard that sound before. It was the sound of a lockdown. "They've sealed the lower decks," he said, his voice grim. "Caspian's making his move." Selune's heart raced. "What do we do?" "We don't stay here," Ronan replied, already moving toward the door. "If Caspian's locked down the lower decks, he's going to send security to search for us. We need to get to the upper levels." Selune nodded, following him out into the corridor. Her mind was spinning with fear and adrenaline, but she trusted Ronan completely. He had a plan, and she knew he wouldn't let Caspian win. They moved quickly through the narrow corridors, dodging security patrols and slipping through hidden maintenance shafts that Ronan knew well. Selune marveled at how easily he navigated the ship, his military training clearly showing as he led her through the maze of hallways. But as they reached the entrance to one of the upper decks, they were stopped by a group of security officers, their blasters raised. "Stop right there," one of them barked. "You're coming with us." Ronan's eyes flicked to Selune, his hand subtly resting on the concealed blaster at his side. He had been hoping to avoid a confrontation, but it seemed Caspian had left them no choice. "I don't think so," Ronan said calmly, stepping in front of Selune to shield her. The security officers advanced, their weapons trained on him. Selune's heart pounded in her chest, but Ronan remained calm, his hand tightening around his blaster. Then, with lightning speed, he drew his weapon and fired. The blast hit the nearest officer, sending him crashing to the ground. Before the others could react, Ronan moved, a blur of motion as he disarmed two more and took cover behind a nearby pillar. "Go!" Ronan shouted to Selune. "I'll hold them off!" Selune hesitated for a moment, fear gripping her, but she knew Ronan was right. If they stayed here, they'd both be caught. She ran toward the maintenance hatch that led to the upper decks, her heart racing as the sounds of blaster fire echoed behind her. Ronan fired again, taking down another officer. He moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, his mind focused on one goal, protecting Selune. But the odds were against him. More security officers were flooding the corridor, and Ronan knew he couldn't hold them off forever. He glanced back toward the hatch, making sure Selune had made it through. She had. Satisfied that she was safe, for now, Ronan turned and ran, using his knowledge of the ship's layout to evade the remaining officers. He would find her again, but first he needed to get them off Caspian's radar. Selune raced through the narrow maintenance corridor, her heart pounding in her chest as she climbed through the maze-like passageways leading to the upper decks. Her hands shook from the adrenaline and fear coursing through her body, but her mind stayed focused on one thing: survival. Ronan was still down there, buying her time, risking his life to keep her safe. She knew he would find a way to escape the security officers, but the fear of losing him gnawed at her insides. They had barely scratched the surface of what was between them, and now it seemed like fate was determined to tear them apart. She reached the upper-level access hatch and forced it open, emerging into one of the ship's quieter corridors. The lavish design of the hallway, with its gold trim and ornate lighting, was a sharp contrast to the stark metal of the lower deck she had just come from, but the opulence of the Elysium felt hollow now. All Selune could think about was Ronan, and how they were running out of time. Down below, Ronan was moving fast. After dispatching the remaining security officers, he quickly mapped out his route in his mind. The ship's intricate design worked in his favor. He knew every back corner, every hidden access point, Years of military experience had given him the ability to think on his feet, and now those skills were being put to the test. He wasn't afraid of Caspian's men. They were well trained, but Ronan had survived far worse. What concerned him more was the feeling in his gut that something bigger was brewing on the ship. He couldn't shake the sense that the Elysium itself was becoming more dangerous by the minute. The ship's systems felt off, the flickering lights, the faint hum of the engine sounding wrong. Ronan ducked into an empty maintenance room, pulling up a holographic interface on the wall. With a few quick taps, he accessed the ship's internal systems, scanning the diagnostic reports. His suspicions were confirmed. The Elysium had encountered a massive asteroid storm not long ago, and while the ship's systems had initially held up, the damage was worse than expected. Several key systems were beginning to fail, including the primary engine core. "Damn it," Ronan muttered under his breath. If the engine core went offline, the ship would be dead in space. He had to find Selune, and fast. Ronan made his way to the upper decks, using every hidden passage and shortcut he knew. After what felt like an eternity of dodging patrols, he finally found Selune waiting in a quiet corridor. Relief washed over him when he saw her, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. Selune ran to him, her arms wrapping around his neck as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I thought," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm here," Ronan said softly, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood there for a moment, taking solace in each other's presence, but the urgency of the situation quickly pulled them back to reality. "We have a bigger problem," Ronan said, pulling back slightly to meet her gaze. "The ship's engine core is failing. If we don't get to the engineering deck and fix it, the Elysium is going to be stranded, and possibly worse." Selune's eyes widened. "I can help with that. I know the systems, but we'll need time and access." "Which is exactly what Caspian doesn't want us to have," Ronan replied grimly. "He's got security crawling all over the ship, and he's not going to stop until he has you." Selune's fear flared again, but she quickly tamped it down. There was no time for panic now. "Then we need to stay ahead of him." Ronan nodded. "Let's go. We'll make for the engine room." The two of them moved quickly and silently through the corridors, heading toward the ship's engineering deck. The ship's grandiose interior, with its luxurious lounges and opulent dining rooms, was eerily quiet now. Most of the passengers were either asleep or blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beneath the surface. Selune's mind raced as she walked beside Ronan. She knew the ship's systems inside and out. After all, she had spent her entire life working with machines on her home planet. But what terrified her wasn't the idea of fixing the engine. It was the fact that they were running out of time, and Caspian's reach was growing longer by the minute. "We'll need to divert power to the core," she said, her voice low but determined. "That should stabilize the systems enough to keep us from losing propulsion." Ronan glanced at her, impressed by how quickly she was formulating a plan. "Can you do it?" Selune nodded. "I can, but it'll take time." Ronan's expression hardened. "Then I'll buy you that time." As Ronan and Selune approached the entrance to the engineering deck, they were stopped by a sudden announcement over the ship's intercom. "Attention, passengers," the smooth voice of the ship's captain echoed through the halls. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, certain areas of the Elysium will be temporarily restricted. Please remain calm and follow the directions of our security personnel." Ronan's eyes narrowed. "That's Caspian." Selune nodded, her heart sinking. Caspian was making his move. The restricted areas meant they were about to be cornered. "We need to move now," Ronan said, urgency in his voice. They slipped through the doors to the engineering deck, the massive space filled with towering machines and humming power generators. It was here that Selune felt most at home. The complexity of the systems didn't faze her. In fact, it gave her a sense of control. "We need to access the main control panel," Selune said, hurrying toward the largest console in the room. Ronan followed, keeping a sharp eye on the doors, knowing it was only a matter of time before Caspian's men found them. Selune's fingers flew across the controls, her eyes scanning the data as she worked to divert power to the engine core. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ronan could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. "They're going to find us soon," Ronan said, his voice low. "How much time do you need?" "Just a little longer," Selune replied, her voice tense as she focused on the controls. "I almost have it." Suddenly, the doors to the engineering deck slid open, and several armed security officers stormed in, their weapons raised. Ronan immediately drew his blaster, taking cover behind one of the large machines as he returned fire. The room erupted into chaos as blaster shots ricocheted off the walls, and Ronan fought to hold the line, keeping the officers away from Selune as she worked. "Almost there," Selune muttered under her breath, her fingers flying over the controls. She could feel the heat of the engine core beneath her, the hum of the power systems growing louder as she rerouted the energy. Just a little more. The room shook suddenly and alarms blared as the engine core flared to life. Selune let out a breath of relief as the ship's system stabilized, the threat of total failure averted, for now. But there was no time to celebrate. The security officers were closing in, and Ronan knew they couldn't stay here any longer. "We need to go!" he shouted, firing another shot that took down one of the officers. Selune nodded, grabbing her tools and running toward Ronan. They sprinted for the exit, dodging blaster fire as they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship. Caspian's men were relentless, but Ronan and Selune were faster, slipping through maintenance shafts and hidden passageways as they made their escape. Finally, they reached the lower decks where they could regroup and plan their next move. "We can't keep running forever," Selune said, breathless, as they stopped to catch their breath. "I know," Ronan replied, his eyes hard, "but we're not done yet. Caspian won't stop until he has you." Selune's gaze met his, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to hang between them. They were up against impossible odds, but they had each other, and that was enough. Ronan Talon and Selune had just managed to escape to the lower decks, but the looming threat of Caspian's forces weighed heavily on them. The engines of the Elysium roared as the ship continued its shaky path, but the explosions that rocked the halls from the sabotage were growing more frequent. Time was running out. "I can't believe he'd destroy the entire ship just to get to us," Selune whispered, her face pale with shock. Her hands trembled as they reached the depths of the ship, hiding from Caspian's forces that had begun to sweep through the corridors. Ronan grimaced. His breathing was uneven, the weight of his injury from the earlier blaster shot still pressing on him. Caspian isn't thinking rationally anymore. He's a cornered animal. Selune moved to check Ronan's wound, quickly rewrapping the makeshift bandage she had placed over his injury. The blood was seeping through. He was losing strength, fast. "You need medical attention," she said, her voice urgent. "If we don't stop the bleeding, you're not going to make it." Ronan shook his head. "We can't stop now. Caspian's forces are sweeping the ship. If we don't get off soon, we'll be trapped here when his fleet arrives, and I need to help the others get off." Suddenly, the ship trembled as another explosion sounded somewhere above them. Caspian's sabotage was in full motion now. The Elysium wouldn't last much longer. As they tried to move deeper into the ship, a holographic message flickered to life from one of the nearby consoles. Caspian's face appeared, bloodied but smiling in a twisted way. His injuries from his confrontation with Ronan hadn't stopped him. "Enjoying the fireworks?" Caspian's voice oozed with dark satisfaction. "I told you, Ronan, if I can't have Selune, no one can." Ronan's eyes narrowed as the image flickered in front of them. "What are you planning, Caspian?" "I've already planted explosives near the ship's central systems," Caspian continued, unfazed by Ronan's defiance. "This ship is going down whether you like it or not. I've called my fleet of 10 warships. They'll be here in 3 hours to finish what I started." Ronan's pulse quickened. He glanced at Selune, whose face had gone pale with fear. "You can't escape this time, Ronan, and Selune, well, she'll belong to no one." With that, the transmission cut off, leaving them in an eerie silence. Ronan clenched his fists, pain shooting through his body from his injury. Caspian was willing to destroy the entire ship, killing thousands, just to satisfy his twisted obsession. Ignoring the searing pain in his side, Ronan hurried through the corridor, making his way to the escape pods. The Elysium was in chaos. Passengers panicked as explosions echoed through the walls, fire and smoke filling the once glittering hallways. Despite his injuries, Ronan took charge. He pulled civilians to safety, directing them toward the lifeboats, calming them with the authority of a war-hardened commander. But his body was failing him. The pain was unbearable, yet he couldn't stop. As he helped a family of 3 reach the last escape pod in the docking bay, the blast came out of nowhere. A bolt of energy hit him square in the back. His body jerked forward, and the shockwave threw him to the ground. Ronan gasped for air, his vision blurring. He fought to stay conscious, his instincts forcing him to raise his blaster and fire at the attacker. The assailant, a rogue security officer working for Caspian, fell dead, but Ronan couldn't hold on any longer. Blood was soaking his clothes, the wound from the blast growing darker and deeper. He collapsed onto the cold metal floor, the world around him dimming. Selune found him moments later, her heart racing as she saw his crumpled form lying motionless. "Ronan!" she screamed, rushing to his side. Her hands shook as she turned him over, his face pale and his breathing shallow. She needed to move him, but her body felt frozen with fear. Caspian's men were hunting for them. She could hear the heavy footsteps of security officers closing in. But she had no choice. Tears stung her eyes as she dragged Ronan's limp body into a nearby room, her muscles straining from the effort. Once inside, she shut the door and barred it, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But the door wouldn't hold for long. She could hear the guards outside, trying to break it down. "Please, Ronan, stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely holding back a sob. She couldn't lose him, not now. Her eyes fell on the deep wound in his back. Desperately, she grabbed a nearby cloth and pressed it against the wound, wrapping it around his chest and pulling it tight. As she did, she noticed something strange. A small device locket on his chest began to glow, displaying numbers and charts. His blood pressure, heart rate, temperature. The device was monitoring his vital signs. Selune stared in confusion. She had known Ronan was special, but this was beyond anything she had expected. What kind of technology was this? Before she could comprehend what was happening, a holographic light shot from the locket and a tall figure appeared in front of her. It was a fleet commander, his uniform adorned with the insignia of a powerful interstellar fleet. The commander's eyes widened in shock. "What happened to him? Who are you?" he demanded, his voice urgent. Selune, still shaken, struggled to explain. I'm Selune. Ronan. He's been shot, and Caspian's fleet is coming. We only have 1 hour before they arrive and destroy the ship." The commander's face turned grim. "You're telling me Caspian's fleet is on its way? We don't have much time. Ronan's personal fleet is light years away, but I'll contact our nearest allies." Selune's heart pounded. Was there hope? The fleet commander acted quickly. He sent out a distress signal to a nearby planet allied with Ronan Talon. Within moments, they had agreed to send 50 warships to rescue the Elysium's passengers and intercept Caspian's incoming fleet. But even with their help, time was running out. As Selune anxiously waited for the rescue, the walls around her began to melt, the heat from the ship's failing system starting to warp the metal. She backed into a corner, fear creeping into her chest. What could she do now? Suddenly, the door burst open, but instead of security forces, a massive humanoid AI robot stepped through. Its gleaming metallic body was highly advanced, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Selune's instinct was to attack. She lunged at the robot, but her blows bounced off its hardened exterior, leaving no mark. The robot calmly approached Ronan, who was still unconscious on the floor, and without hesitation it inserted a pin into his vein, administering a life-saving combination of medicine and glucose. Selune, breathing hard, stood back in shock. What are you?" The robot paused, then turned its glowing eyes toward her. "I am Ronan Talon's personal AI assigned to ensure his safety and health at all times. His body is equipped with a monitoring device that alerts me whenever his vitals are in danger." Selune's mind reeled. "You've been tracking him this whole time?" "Yes," the AI responded, "and I am not alone." The door behind the AI opened once more, and hundreds of AI war robots streamed in, their sleek forms ready for battle. Selune watched in awe as the robots swiftly moved to secure the area, their advanced technology far beyond anything she had seen. Outside, through the viewport, Selune saw the arrival of 1,000 AI warships, Ronan's private fleet, swooping in to engage with Caspian's forces. The AI fleet had already intercepted Caspian's warships and were systematically destroying them. As the AI robots continued their work, Ronan's condition improved rapidly. The advanced medical treatment administered by his personal AI stabilized his vital signs, and he slowly began to regain consciousness. Selune knelt beside him, tears of relief filling her eyes as he stirred. "Ronan, you're okay." Ronan's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked disoriented. But then he saw her, his expression softening as he reached out to take her hand. "You saved me," he whispered. Selune shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "No, Ronan, I think you saved us all." It was then that the AI spoke again. "Selune, it is time you knew the truth. Ronan Talon is not merely a warship pilot. He is the wealthiest person in the Milky Way galaxy. He owns thousands of star systems and commands the largest private fleet in the known universe." Selune blinked, stunned by the revelation. She had known Ronan was special, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. As Ronan regained consciousness, the faint hum of the AI systems around him was the first thing he noticed. His body ached, and the lingering pain from the blaster wound made every movement feel like a struggle. But through the haze of his awakening, his eyes focused on the one constant that had anchored him throughout this chaos, Selune. She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with both relief and concern. The weight of everything they had been through hung in the air between them. Despite the noise of battle outside, the tremors that rocked the ship, and the thrum of AI robots working tirelessly to stabilize the situation, they shared a moment of quiet, of connection. "Ronan, thank the stars," Selune breathed, clutching his hand. Her voice trembled, her fear finally breaking through the resolve she'd been holding on to for so long. "I thought I was going to lose you." Ronan smiled weakly, squeezing her hand back. "I promised I'd stay with you." The AI robot beside them confirmed that Ronan's vitals were stabilizing. The advanced medical care had done its job, but the exhaustion was clear on his face. Selune helped him sit up, her hand still in his. The reality of what she had just learned about him, his true identity, his power, was starting to sink in, but she hadn't had the time to process it fully. He wasn't just a warship pilot. He was the wealthiest person in the galaxy, commanding a fleet and ruling over thousands of star systems. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice soft. Ronan met her gaze, his expression gentle. "I didn't want you to see me for my power or my wealth. I wanted you to see me for who I really am, just Ronan." Selune smiled, a mixture of understanding and wonder on her face. "And that's exactly who I see." Outside the safety of the room, the AI war robots moved with precision and unmatched speed, neutralizing Caspian's forces across the Elysium. The once glittering luxury liner had become a battlefield, but it was a battle that Ronan's personal fleet had decisively turned in their favor. Caspian's 10 warships, which had been poised to finish off the survivors of the sabotage, never stood a chance. The AI fleet, equipped with technology light years beyond Caspian's warships, tore through the enemy vessels with ruthless efficiency. One by one, Caspian's ships were neutralized, their debris scattering into the cold vacuum of space. Back on the Elysium, Caspian, who had retreated to his private quarters, watched in horror as his plan unraveled before his eyes. His pride, his fleet, his legacy, all of it was being destroyed by the one man he had sworn to defeat. He had always underestimated Ronan, believing his own wealth and power to be unrivaled. But now he was faced with the cold reality that Ronan Talon's empire was far beyond his reach. As the last of his ships fell, Caspian knew he had lost. In a final act of desperation, Caspian attempted to flee the ship, hoping to disappear before Ronan's forces could capture him. But his plan was futile. The AI war robots were everywhere, and his movements were tracked the moment he left his quarters. Before he could reach the hangar bay, a squad of Ronan's personal AI soldiers intercepted him. They surrounded him, their blasters trained on him, ready to deliver justice. Caspian, defeated, dropped to his knees. His empire was gone, his fleet obliterated, and his reputation in ruins. There was nothing left for him now. "Ronan, he'll regret this," Caspian muttered bitterly, though he knew the words held no weight anymore. The AI soldiers took him into custody, and with that, Caspian's reign of terror came to an end. With Caspian's warships destroyed and the sabotage neutralized, the Elysium was finally safe. Ronan's fleet of 1,000 AI warships, which had arrived just in time, ensured the passengers' safety, assisting with evacuation and repair efforts. The nearby 50 Allied warships, summoned by the fleet commander, provided additional support to secure the ship and protect the civilians. In the aftermath of the battle, Ronan, still weak but recovering quickly, stood at the viewport with Selune. Together they watched as the AI fleet efficiently coordinated the rescue operation. Thousands of lives had been saved, and peace had been restored, though the damage to the ship and to so many lives would be felt for a long time. "You saved us all," Selune said quietly, leaning into Ronan's side. Ronan shook his head. "We saved each other." As the chaos died down, Selune finally had time to process what the AI had told her. Ronan Talon, the man she had grown to love, was no ordinary pilot. He was the most powerful and wealthiest individual in the galaxy, controlling thousands of star systems and commanding the largest fleet ever known. "You're not just any man, Ronan," Selune said softly, looking at him with awe. "You could have anything you wanted in this galaxy. Why hide it?" Ronan took her hand, his eyes soft with affection. "Because none of that matters if I don't have someone who sees the real me. I didn't want to live as some figurehead of power. I wanted to be seen for who I am, not for what I own." Selune smiled, understanding him fully now. "And you found that?" "I found you," Ronan said, his voice filled with emotion. Months had passed since the destruction of the Elysium, and the galaxy had returned to a state of relative peace. Caspian, now a forgotten figure, was imprisoned for his crimes, while Ronan's name was spoken of in reverence and respect across the stars. Ronan and Selune now lived on Ronan's favorite planet, a lush and stunning world filled with tranquility and natural beauty. On a private island, surrounded by serene seas and breathtaking landscapes, they built a new life together. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, attended only by a few close friends and Ronan's trusted allies. The ceremony, held on the shores of the island, was simple yet beautiful, just as they had both wanted. They exchanged vows under the golden glow of a setting sun, with the soft sounds of the ocean around them. "I've never felt more at peace," Selune whispered as they stood on the sandy beach, her hand in Ronan's. Ronan smiled, his heart full. "This is where we belong." Years passed, and their family grew. 3 children played on the shores of their island, laughing and running through the crystal-clear waters. The life they had built together was one of love, peace, and joy, far removed from the chaos and danger they had once faced. Ronan and Selune sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, their hearts content. "This is all I ever wanted," Ronan said softly, his arm wrapped around Selune. "And now we have it," Selune replied, leaning into him, her heart full of love. Together they faced the future, knowing that no matter what challenges might come, they would face them side by side. Their journey, which had begun in the heart of danger, had led them to a place of peace, a place where they could truly call home.